On reserve community fire protection standards. There isn't a regulated national standard. So it can be quite confusing for communities that want to implement a robust standard because there's so many different ways of doing it. While there is the NFPA standards through the National Fire Protection Association, which really I think the majority of provinces and territories follow, some of them don't, like Alberta, don't formally require the NFPA guidelines to be used, but some other provinces might rely on them formally. And ISK follows NFPA as a good practice. However, they have their own standards and tiers for their funding models. So I'm going to go through how we've broken down the ISK standards for funding, because at least if you're going to start seeking funds to enhance your community fire protection services, this is a good place to start because then you can at least talk ISK's language and hopefully meet a lot of their grant application requirements. So ISK has broken down their fire protection standards into three tiers. Tier one is fire prevention and educational programming. Tier two is capacity development and training. And tier three is capital investment. So the slides that you're going to see over the next few minutes here, each section of each slide breaks into one of these three tiers. So as we're going along, maybe just take your paper, put tier one, fire prevention educational programming, tier two, capacity development and training, tier three, capital investments. Okay, so we'll start with governance. This is kind of like the strategic policy side of, fire services. And, you really ought to have a band council resolution that states your community will have its own fire protection service, either independently or through an agreement with a neighboring community, either as a volunteer or paid or a hybrid of paid and volunteer, whatever the case is, you've got to have that governance set up. So chief and council have approved it. You've got a fires service policy because you want the priorities of the fire service to be laid out. You need finance needs to know that that budget is allocated legally, and it's going to set out the overall accountability. So, talking about in there, maybe your nation has a counselor who has fire under their portfolio, or maybe fire is under public works or capital projects, who knows, or maybe it's its own department. Depending on the size of your community, you can structure it however you like, but you've got to have that governance system laid out because this governance system will also be identified in your emergency management plan. You're going to want those in the community to know what the fire service is, what its roles are in an emergency and disaster. Is it there for wildland urban interface firefighting? Is it there just for structural fires? Is it there for both? Does it deal with car collisions? Like whatever it is, that's where all of this is going to be set out. And when you're talking to ISK, it's really good to identify, which tier you want to focus your funding on and where you're aiming. So prevention really focuses on, getting out into the community, working with members, elders, other departments, youth, going to schools and talking about fire prevention. What causes a home fire, grease fires, how to properly extinguish them, talking about fire smarting around the community and around buildings, talking about the importance of having a fire extinguisher and changing your batteries in smoke alarms. All of those, programs and public awareness campaigns fit into the prevention side. So if your community is at a stage where it has a fire service and It's fairly well equipped, but there is still a high risk in the community. Prevention might be one place you want to focus on developing some public awareness campaigns, and there's funding available for that. Personnel side of the fire service. So this is right from, you know, talking about governance. Is it going to be a volunteer service, a paid service, or a hybrid of volunteers and paid? What are the positions in the fire service? How are you going to recruit? Do you have job descriptions? What are your retention programs like to keep people coming back to the fire hall as volunteers or as staff? What training are they required to be hired? And what training are they required to have as they progress in the profession? We know that an engaged workforce that feels valued and is developed is going to perform better. Personnel side of the standards, this is where you work with all of that, and you can get funding for training. You can get funding for different programs and development programs and staff programs and recruitment support. So work with your human resources department as well. They play a major function in this because they've got to have the process in place and the understanding of how to best support the hiring managers or the fire chief in recruitment. Equipment. So hang on a second. I'm going to go back. All right, I fixed that. Equipment. This is the fun part for a lot of communities, right? This is where actually, too, a lot of communities make the mistake of just starting here. They buy equipment without having a clear governance structure. Equipment. This is where I see a lot of communities, this is almost sometimes where they start. And it's not always the best starting place. Yes, you need gear, but if you don't have the people trained on it, you don't have them certified to maintain it and test it and clean it, and you don't have the facilities to keep it clean and maintain it, this gear isn't going to last very long, especially if you've got a very, very active service. So when you're thinking about, purchasing equipment, you want to fall back to some of the things you did within governance, priorities, strategies, looking at where you need to make some improvements, and really start to focus on making sure that you've got the staff and the people trained with the right qualifications to maintain and use whatever they've got. Because all too often I've walked into fire service halls where they don't have a good laundry service or a good laundry facility, and the equipment is just thrown, hanging over a wall because they sprayed it off with a hose and that doesn't decontaminate it properly. Excuse me. Or I've seen cases where firefighters, they'll wear their kit and they throw their gear in the back of their vehicle. Whoops. And what that does is it contaminates the inside of a vehicle, right? With soot and ash and char from a house fire. And some of that stuff can be toxic. So equipment is one area where ISC funds. And if you have a really good, robust plan for what equipment you need and why and how it's going to be used and how you're going to maintain it and how it's going to enhance your service, you can make a good case for equipment. Facilities. This is where, things like the laundry come in. Having outside hose bibs so you can access water from a water treatment plant so it's not having to be hauled in. Storage space is really, really important, right? You want to have lots of storage so you've got lots of room. You want big open areas where, firefighters can kick off muddy boots and not mess up the office space or the attached office space. You want lots of room outside where you can set up, training pools of water for practice. You want to have, if you can, concrete driveways. So, trucks are coming in on concrete rather than, mud and dirt roads. Facilities, there's often, a big need here to really focus on some key areas, especially around mental health. So don't ignore, having a nice kitchen and common room for staff and firefighters to congregate and talk and cook and have meals. Workouts facilities, prayer or cultural spaces if needed. Even if you can afford to incorporate sleeping areas so people can spend the night at the fire hall, really important, especially during seasons where it might be a little bit more active. We have assessments for facilities in facility design. And if you want to get access to those, let us know. But doing these types of assessments to sort of recognize how your facilities impact your service level standards is critical. Because if you don't have the right facilities, but you've got the right equipment and you can't store that equipment, your operations are going to suffer. Operations. This is yeah, this is a really hard area to measure, especially if you're in a community that isn't collecting data on its fire service. And that actually is quite common. You can go to communities and they won't know how many fire calls they've had in a year, how many structural fires, how many, vehicle collisions did they respond to, what's their average response time. Without that data, without being able to measure it, it's really hard to get better. So within your day-to-day operations, trying starting at some point to collect this data is critical because it's going to really help you with your ISC grant application. That if you can say, uh, we responded to 30 structural fires last year. We averaged 12 minutes from the first initial call to when they were on site, and you want to bring in some training and equipment that's going to reduce that call time to 7 minutes. That's significant. And if you can show and prove that through data and set some goals and objectives using that data, you're going to make your case for funding a lot stronger. Planning, right? Community risk assessments, working with your emergency management program to identify risks and impacts so you can put those into the grant process and grant application. Community risk reduction plans and strategies. So what can be funded through fire services in terms of support to help reduce risk around, urban interface fires, structural fires, includes fire smarting, long-term capital planning. So looking at the facilities and the equipment and the operations you have today, and coming up with a 5-year long-term plan to say we want to go from A to B in 5 years, and here's what we're going to need. All of this falls with under the planning side of things, and you can work with your emergency management office on the planning process and the risk assessment. You can actually get quite a bit of support and resources and data from them because they're out there doing a very similar thing. So you might as well work together, right, on this. Lastly, response. So this is where you get into wanting to either determine or develop a fire service that is independent in your community. Maybe you've got mutual aid agreements with neighboring partners. Maybe you work with other groups to offset. You can even contract some response capability. There are private contractors out there for fire services. Whatever the setup of your fire service is under the governance strategy, you want to look at bringing in a response protocol that is there really to save lives. That's your number one objective. And how you do that through planning, operations, equipment, facilities, governance, prevention. This is where that all ties into, because this, response is your main priority in fire. You can try to prevent all the fires you want, but you're still going to have them. So you want to get out there as quick as possible. And you want to make sure that after that response, your post-incident reporting is has data integrity, meaning you're collecting the same bits of data every call, reporting it in the same way, and you're debriefing in the same way with your firefighters, right? You want to at least do a post-incident report after every call. Doesn't have to be super complicated. If it's just, maybe someone's CO2 detector went off and it was just a battery issue. I mean, that's different than having to report on a, structural fire where 2 houses and 2 neighboring homes caught fire. But the idea here is you want to get that reporting in place, have conversations with your team about what went well, what could have gone better, because that's going to feed into your plans. It's going to feed into your next grant application. It's going to help you assess your fire services in the future. And we recommend that you do a fire service assessment annually. If you've never done one before, the first one is going to take a lot longer because you're just getting the process in place and you're probably having to track down a lot of the data. But once you get that system in place, it actually becomes more efficient year over year, and you get better at it, right? Because you've developed the data points, you develop the mechanisms to collect the data. You're starting to be able to identify trends, and you can focus and prioritize where you want to get your grant funding and spend your money to improve your operations. So we have an assessment that goes through all of these. It's about 59 or 60 questions, plus a lot of anecdotal good practices that are collected through experienced fire chiefs that have done this before. So if you need help with that, let us know. But I hope this brought some value to you in your efforts to improve your fire service and try and get that funding from ISK. Talk to you later. Thanks for joining us at Hazardscape. You can subscribe to our YouTube and find our ad-free training videos by becoming a supporter on Patreon with a network of other Indigenous peoples looking to make their communities safer. And remember, know your hazardscape and be prepared.